The door groaned shut behind me, and for a moment all I could hear was the wind, howling, clawing at the logs of my little lodge, like it was determined to come inside with me. Snow was still clinging to my jacket, melting in cold little rivulets down my neck, but the moment I stepped fully into the room, the warmth wrapped around me like a blanket. The fire was already going. I always kept it banked low when I left for the day, just enough to coax back to life with a few logs. Now it crackled brightly, throwing out that deep orange glow that made the whole place feel small in the best possible way. My boots thudded on the wooden floor as I crossed to the hearth, holding out my hands to the heat, feeling the sting of thawing fingers. Outside, it was chaos, white, swirling chaos. Through the frosted window, I could barely see more than vague shadows of trees bending under the weight of snow. The storm had picked up fast tonight, faster than anyone had warned. By the time I finished my shift, the world looked like it had been erased and redrawn in nothing but white. But in here it was calm. I shrugged off my jacket, hanging it near the stove where it could dry, and listened to the soft settling noises of the place. The faint pop of the fire, the gentle hum of the kettle warming on the stove, the sigh of the wind pressing against the cabin walls, but never quite finding a way inside. I padded across the room in my thick socks and lowered myself into my favorite chair, the old creaky one with the wool blanket draped over the back. The moment I sat, my whole body relaxed in a way it never managed anywhere else. I pulled the blanket over my legs, letting the heat seep into me while the storm continued to thrash uselessly outside. For a long moment, I just breathed, warm, smoky air from the fire, that sharp, clean scent of winter sneaking through the gaps in the window frame. My eyelids felt heavy, and the flickering firelight made everything blur softly at the edges. It didn't matter how hard the day had been out there. It didn't matter how deep the snow was piling, or how fiercely the wind tried to batter its way in. This was my little pocket of peace, my lodge, my fire, my warm corner of the world. And as the storm roared on, I let myself sink deeper into the chair, grateful for the simple quiet of being home. The longer I sat there, the more the cabin's familiar scent wrapped itself around me. Warm, earthy, comforting in a way nothing else ever was after a long shift. The wood inside the lodge always carried its own smell, something deep and resinous, like the memory of forests long gone. The heat from the fire brought it out even more, warming the logs of the walls until they released that rich woody aroma that seemed to sink into my clothes, my hair, even my skin. But tonight, there was something sweeter woven through it, something soft and subtle. Cinnamon. I'd left a pot of spiced cider simmering earlier, and even though it had long since cooled, a faint hint of it still lingered in the air. It mixed with the smell of the firewood, the old pine floorboards, and the wool blankets draped over the furniture. It was the kind of scent that felt like it tugged the cold out of my bones and replaced it with warmth. I inhaled slowly, letting it settle in my chest. Woody warmth, a curl of cinnamon, a whisper of smoke. It was the smell of winter evenings spent safely indoors, of storms you didn't have to battle anymore, of a place that held on to heat and memories and quiet. Outside, the snow battered the windows in frantic pulses, but in here, the air felt thick with comfort, warm, spiced, and utterly mine. Every so often, even through all that warmth, I could feel a thin ribbon of cold slip its way into the room. The cabin was old, sturdy, dependable, but never perfect, and on nights like this, the winter liked to remind me of that fact. A faint draft drifted in through the small gap near the window frame, cool enough to brush against my ankles like a curious ghost. It wasn't strong, not enough to chill the room, but just enough to make the fire's glow feel even more welcoming. The cold and the heat seemed to meet right there in the middle of the room, one soft, one sharp, balancing each other out. Sometimes the draft carried the smell of the storm with it, that crisp, icy scent of fresh snow. Other times it was just a whisper of cold air slipping over the floorboards, weaving between chair legs and nudging at the edges of my blanket. I tugged the wool a little tighter around myself, feeling the contrast, the warmth from the fire on my face, the coolness at my feet. It grounded me somehow, reminded me that the world outside was wild and frozen and roaring, and that I was safely tucked away from it, wrapped in blankets and cinnamon-tinged air, listening to the wind try and fail to reclaim even one corner of my lodge. The storm could send all the drafts it wanted. The fire would win every time. The walk back from the workshop had been the kind of cold that didn't just touch you, it bit. The kind that slid straight through every layer you thought would protect you and settled deep in your bones like it planned on staying a while. The snow had already been knee-deep in some places, soft and powdery on top, but heavy underneath. And every step felt like wading through a frozen sea. The wind didn't help either. It whipped across the path in sharp, stinging bursts that made my eyes water and forced me to bow my head as I trudged forward. The flakes were so thick they blurred the world into nothing but white, turning the familiar trail home into something strange and shifting. My breath came out in clouds so dense they felt like smoke, and the cold air burned my throat each time I inhaled. I kept my hands shoved deep into my gloves, but even then, the tips of my fingers throbbed with that numb ache that warns you they're on their way to disappearing if you're not careful. My cheeks stung, my ears rang, and my beard gathered little crystals of frost that crackled when I finally ducked inside. By the time the cabin came into view, half hidden behind curtains of snow, I felt like I'd been walking forever. But seeing that faint orange glow through the frosted window, that was everything. It made me push the last few steps faster, boots crunching hard into the drifts. So stepping inside, shedding the cold, letting the warmth hit me, it wasn't just comforting. It felt like stepping out of another world entirely. The world outside had been brutal, breath-stealing, relentless, but here, inside the lodge, I could finally thaw out and breathe again. Once the feeling finally crept back into my fingers, just enough to trust them again, I decided I'd earned something more than just warmth from the fire. A night like this called for a proper reward, not just any drink. A deluxe hot chocolate, I pushed myself up from the chair, the blanket sliding off my lap, and padded over to the small kitchen nook. The cold draft nipped at my ankles as if trying to convince me to sit back down, but the thought of that chocolatey richness pulled me forward. I grabbed my favorite mug, the heavy chipped one that somehow made everything taste better, and set it on the counter. The kettle was still warm from earlier, and soon it was rumbling to life again. I rummaged in the cupboard for the tin of proper cocoa powder, the good stuff I'd been saving for nights exactly like this. Into the mug went a generous heap of it, followed by a splash of milk to make the base silky. Then came the best part, the extras. A swirl of cream, a sprinkle of cinnamon, a handful of mini marshmallows that would soon melt into sugary little islands of softness. And because I'd had a long day and survived a brutal walk home, I shaved a bit of dark chocolate over the top, thin curls that would melt the instant the hot water hit. When the kettle clicked, the steam rose in soft curls, carrying the promise of warmth with it. I poured slowly, watching everything mingle into a rich, velvety swirl. The smell alone felt like a hug. I wrapped my hands around the mug, letting the heat seep into my palms, and carried it back to my chair. The storm still raged outside, the draft still brushing along the floor, but with that deluxe hot chocolate warming my hands and the fire warming everything else. The winter didn't seem nearly as unforgiving. I settled back into my chair with the mug warming my hands, letting my eyes drift around the cabin. The place always looked its coziest on nights like this, when the storm outside made every little detail feel even more precious. The first thing that always caught my eye was the rug, thick, soft, and woven in deep earthy colors. It sprawled across the floor in front of the fire like an invitation. I'd bartered for it years ago, made by someone who knew how to weave warmth into every fiber. Even now, with the draft sneaking under the window, the rug kept the cold from ever finding my toes. The furniture around me was the kind I trusted. Solid, warm to the touch, all handmade. Not store-bought, not polished to perfection, but shaped with care and a good knife. The little wooden table beside my chair had uneven legs if you looked too closely, and the shelves were crooked in a charming sort of way. But they held everything steady, books, jars of spices, tiny carvings scattered here and there. The chair I sat in creaked with age, the carved patterns along its arms smoothed by years of leaning into it after long shifts. And then, tucked on the shelves and in little baskets around the room, were the toys. My side projects, my quiet joy. Some were simple, wooden animals with rounded edges, the kind you could palm comfortably. Others were more intricate, a small sleigh with perfectly fitted runners, a set of tiny wooden soldiers, and a miniature rocking horse that I hadn't quite finished painting. I worked on them in the evenings when the fire was roaring and the world outside was too cold to do anything but stay in and carve. Each toy carried marks of the time I'd spent on it, tiny nicks where I'd slipped, smooth curves I'd sanded until they felt like river stones. They made the cabin feel alive somehow, like each one held a bit of warmth and personality, a bit of the long winter nights I'd poured into them. The storm pressed against the walls again, rattling the window just slightly, but I only pulled the blanket higher and took another sip of hot chocolate. With the rug soft underfoot, the handmade furniture surrounding me, and my little collection of toys watching quietly from their shelves, the cabin felt like an extension of me. Warm, imperfect, comforting, a place built slowly, piece by piece, into a home. As I leaned back, sipping the last of my hot chocolate, a thought nudged its way into my mind, one I'd been conveniently ignoring all week. It was almost time to start the baking. The work celebration was coming up fast, and every year I somehow ended up being the one who brought the sweet treats. Maybe it was because I lived closest to the workshop, or maybe because everyone knew I secretly enjoyed it more than I pretended to. Either way, the moment December rolled in, they all started dropping not-so-subtle hints. You are making those cinnamon cookies again, right? You think you could do the fudge with the little snowflake shapes this year. Oh, and the mince pies. Please tell me you're bringing the mince pies. I glanced over toward the kitchen. My baking tins were stacked neatly on the shelf, waiting. The wooden rolling pin carved by a friend years ago sat beside a bowl filled with spices I'd already set out. Cinnamon sticks, nutmeg, cloves, star anise. Just looking at them was enough to conjure the scent of everything I'd soon be pulling from the oven. I'd be making the classics, of course. Cinnamon cookies, soft in the middle with just a tiny crunch at the edges. Mince pies, buttery pastry dusted with sugar that crackled under your fingertips. Gingerbread shaped into trees and stars, and maybe if I had time, a few toys to match the ones scattered around the cabin. And then there were the extras I always added at the last minute. Spiced apple hand pies, dripping with caramel, chocolate truffles rolled in cocoa and crushed nuts, vanilla fudge swirled with peppermint for a winter bite. The thought of it warmed me almost as much as the fire. The mixing, the kneading, the smell of dough rising in the warmth of the cabin, the way the windows fogged up from the oven while the snow raged outside. It wasn't just baking, it was a whole winter ritual. I'd start tomorrow, I decided. Tonight, I'd rest by the fire a while longer, warm and content, but soon enough the cabin would be filled with the sounds of clinking bowls and the scent of sugar and spices drifting into every corner, settling into the wooden walls the same way the cinnamon from earlier had. The work celebration might still be days away, but the baking season, my little personal tradition, was just about to begin. As the fire settled into a steady crackle and the storm's fury softened into a muffled roar, another sound began to filter through the walls. Faint, distant, but familiar, the gentle buzz of life from the neighboring cabins. It always surprised me how sound could travel on nights like this. Maybe it was the snow, maybe it was the stillness beneath the wind, but I could hear the soft hum of the little community around me, tucked among the trees like warm lanterns scattered through the dark. From one cabin came the unmistakable clatter of pots and pans, someone making a late dinner, probably trying to shake off the cold just as I had. The sizzle of something hitting a hot pan rose for a moment before fading into the night. I could almost guess who it was. Some of my coworkers had a habit of cooking elaborate meals at odd hours, especially after long shifts. Another cabin carried quieter sounds, footsteps, then silence. Someone had clearly gone straight to bed, worn out by the day and the walk home through the storm. I imagined them crawling under heavy blankets, letting the glow of their own fire lull them into sleep while the wind rattled harmlessly outside. But the faintest, most distinctive noise came from farther out, near the stables. A low murmur of voices, soft and steady, mixed with the occasional snort or gentle stomp of hooves. A couple of the workers were tending to the reindeer, making sure they were fed and brushed down, their coats free of snow. The animals didn't mind the cold much, they were built for it, but the caretakers liked to give them an extra bit of attention on nights like this. The faint jingle of harness bells drifted through the air for a moment. Someone adjusting straps, maybe, or a reindeer shaking its head in that impatient way they do when they want another handful of feed. All those small sounds, dinner cooking, footsteps winding down for the night, reindeer being fussed over, wove together with the crackle of my fire and the whisper of snow against the window. It made the whole settlement feel alive, connected, even in the heart of a howling winter night. Each of us tucked into our own cozy cabins, each of us recovering from the day in our own ways, yet never fully alone. Back inside my little cabin, the warmth, the firelight, and the quiet all seemed to fold in around me at once, and that's when the tiredness truly hit. I'd felt it creeping in earlier, somewhere between thawing my hands by the fire and taking that first sip of hot chocolate, but now it settled over me fully, like a heavy wool cloak. The kind you don't fight, because the weight of it is comforting. It made sense. I'd been up long before dawn, dragging myself out of bed while the stars were still sharp in the sky, the cabin icy enough that I could see my breath inside. Work today had been steady, relentless in that way. Winter shifts always were. Fixing things, carving things, checking equipment, organizing supplies, it all blurred together after a while. And then there was the walk home through the storm, which had drained the last of my energy, like it always did. Now, sitting here, I could feel every hour of the day in my bones. My eyelids felt warm and heavy, blinking slower and slower as the fire popped softly, throwing shifting shadows across the rug. The flicker of the flames had that hypnotic pull, the kind that made you want to just sink deeper into the chair and let the world fade out. The cabin only added to that drowsy comfort, the cinnamon-sweet air, the soft rug under my feet, the faint draft cooling my ankles, just enough to make the blanket feel even warmer. The handmade toys watching from their shelves like quiet little guardians of the night. Even the distant sounds from the other cabins were fading, now steady. Reassuring murmurs that softened into the snowy quiet. I stretched my legs out toward the fire, feeling the heat kiss the tips of my socks, My muscles relaxed in a slow, melting way, loosening after a day of being tensed against the cold. The mug was empty beside me, but its warmth lingered in my hands, making them pleasantly numb and comfortable. Everything felt slow, soft, peaceful. I could head to bed soon, I told myself. Just a few more minutes in the chair, just until the fire settled a little more, just until I gathered the energy to stand. But even that thought felt distant, drifting lazily through my mind like a snowflake that had lost its urgency. For now, I simply let the sleepiness wash over me, warm and gentle, surrounded by the quiet heartbeat of my little cabin, as the storm continued to roar outside, far away, unable to touch the peace I'd found here. In that warm, flickering glow of the cabin, a kind of calm settled over me that felt deeper than simple tiredness. It was the kind of relaxation that wrapped itself around your shoulders, sank into your spine, and reminded you quietly, firmly, that not everything in life needed to be a battle. Sitting there, listening to the gentle crackle of the fire, I felt something I didn't always admit to myself. In this little corner of the world, I didn't need to stress. Not really, not tonight. Work would always be work. Winter storms would always come and go. Tools would break. Projects would run late. People would get tired. That was just life. But here, in my cabin, warmed by firelight and cinnamon and quiet, none of that seemed like a reason to worry. The room itself seemed to breathe with me, as if reminding me of a truth I often forgot, that stress is something the world tries to hand you, but you don't always have to take it. The wooden walls stood steady against the storm. The rug was soft beneath my feet. The handmade furniture creaked in the familiar way that meant home. My little wooden toys sat patiently on the shelves, waiting for the next free evening I'd carve them into something more. Everything around me existed without urgency, without pressure, without expectation. And I realized, sinking deeper into the chair, that most of the things I worried about never truly mattered as much as I thought they did. There was always another day, another chance, another quiet night like this, waiting on the other side of whatever went wrong. Storms ended, workloads eased. Mornings came with fresh starts. In this cabin, wrapped in warmth and stillness, it felt easy to remember that life didn't have to be a rush. Nothing outside these four walls felt urgent enough to disturb this peace. I let out a long breath, slow and steady, and felt the last bits of tension drain from my shoulders. Tonight, there was no need to stress, no need to hurry, no need to carry anything heavier than the blanket draped across me. Just the fire, the quiet, and the understanding that sometimes, maybe more often than we realize, there's no real reason to stress at all. As the minutes drifted by, the night outside began to settle into a deeper stillness. The storm hadn't stopped, not entirely, but it had quieted, softened, like even it was growing tired and curling up to rest. The wind no longer clawed at the cabin with the same fierce urgency. Instead, it whispered against the logs, gentle and distant. Every so often, cutting through that snowy silence, came the soft hoot of an owl. It echoed from somewhere in the tree line beyond the neighboring cabins, low and steady, one of those comforting sounds that somehow made the night feel less empty. I'd grown used to that owl over the years. It had a way of appearing on the coldest nights, calling out like it was keeping watch over all of us tucked away in our little shelters. Each hoot drifted through the air like a reminder that life continued quietly outside, even in deep winter. Inside, the fire had settled into a soft, rhythmic crackle. Not the energetic roar from earlier when I'd first stoked it, but a gentle, almost sleepy sound. Small pops, tiny sparks shifting as the logs glowed deeper and deeper into their embers. The flames danced lazily, casting warm ripples of light across the rug and up the wooden walls, moving like they were breathing in time with the night. The cabin felt wrapped in a peaceful hush. The owl hooted again, slow and distant. The fire answered with a mellow crackle. Everything else was quiet, comfortably, naturally quiet. The kind of quiet that didn't feel empty at all, but full of warmth and calm, as if the whole world had leaned back, exhaled, and decided to rest. I let my head sink back against the chair, eyelids heavy, heart steady. The day was behind me. The night was soft and calm, and the only sounds were the ones that made the world feel safe. A lone owl calling to the dark, a fire whispering as it glowed. Nothing more was needed. I shifted slightly in the chair, adjusting the blanket around my shoulders, and slid my hands into the pockets of my work trousers to warm my fingers a bit more. Even with the fire glowing and the cabin snug, there was still that tiny chill clinging to my fingertips, a leftover reminder of the storm outside. My pockets were always a little chaotic by the end of the day, and tonight was no different. The moment my hands slipped inside, they brushed against a jumble of odds and ends I'd forgotten I'd stuffed in there during the long hours at the workshop. My fingers found a loose wooden button first, smooth on one side, slightly rough on the other, where I'd been sanding it earlier. I'd meant to finish drilling the tiny holes, but the cold had set in early and sent us all packing before I got around to it. Next, I felt the familiar shape of a small carving knife, the one I used for fine details. I always kept it on me, even when I wasn't supposed to. Its handle was worn perfectly to the curve of my hand, and just touching it made me think of the half-finished toy horse sitting on my shelf. Then there was a tangle of twine, a couple of miniature wooden gears, and of course a few stray screws that had somehow multiplied since the morning. I curled my fingers around the small collection instinctively, like a pouch of memories from the day, and at the very bottom of the pocket, I found something that made me smile. A tiny wooden star, one of the little decorations I'd been carving absent-mindedly during a quiet moment, just before lunch. I must have slipped it into my pocket without thinking. Its edges were smooth, polished, just enough to catch the light, and it felt like carrying a fragment of the workshop's warm, industrious atmosphere right here in the cabin. Feeling all those little pieces, tools, scraps, unfinished projects, brought a strange comfort. They were reminders of the work I enjoyed, the steady rhythm of carving and shaping and building. They were pieces of the world outside this warm cabin, tucked away in my pockets like harmless secrets. I pulled my hands out eventually, fingers warmer now, but I left everything where it was. It felt right knowing it was all still there. Bits of the day nestled quietly against the fabric, waiting to be sorted tomorrow. For now, the fire crackled softly, the owl hooted once more in the distance, and the cabin wrapped itself around me as the night continued to settle into perfect, peaceful quiet.